Welcome back. In today's lecture, I wanted to talk to you all about a worldview called hedonism. And I wanted to focus on this particular worldview before we move into the different moral theories, although we'll certainly be returning to many of these ideas when we get to one of the moral theories called utilitarianism. But I wanted to focus on this one today because it is very pervasive in our culture. It's one that many people have embraced, even if they've never heard the term hedonism, if they don't know what that means. Many of my students will also have embraced this particular idea. And so I wanted to give a little bit of background, and I wanted to give you guys some food for thought about this particular worldview. That way, if it is your worldview, it'll give you a few things to think about. But also, if you know someone whose worldview this might be, then it will help you to understand them. And in fact, you may have someone in your life that you've never been able to understand that why they do the things they do, and perhaps their worldview is hedonism, and if it is, then perhaps today, by the time we're finished with this, you'll have figured out, hey, that's their worldview, and that's why they keep doing what they keep doing. So I wanted to give this to you as part of this course, partly because, as I said, it is so pervasive. And so for many of you, I think it will be useful information. It's one of the reasons I'm focusing on it here, while I haven't focused as much on other worldviews, but I wanted to give this one special attention simply because I think it can help you tremendously. And part of the idea in this course is that the information that you're getting is going to be applicable to your, if not daily life, to other parts of your lives as well. And so I think this information will be very pertinent for my students, and that's why I wanted to include it here. So the worldview is hedonism, and hedonism defines good and bad morally, as well as other things. But in this case, because we're focused on the moral question, hedonism defines good and bad in terms of pleasure and pain. The ultimate purpose of man is found in the enjoyment of pleasure and in the avoidance of pain. Now, in that last lecture, I know we talked about this briefly as I went down the list of foundations for truth, and so some of this is going to be really familiar, but that's a good thing. Repetition helps us to retain, and then I'm going to give you more information that's going to help you understand this particular worldview even better. So, because we're trying to avoid pain and indulge ourselves, or at least find some measure of pleasure in our lives, man is constantly searching for an increase in pleasure, and is constantly searching for a decrease of pain. The true hedonist seeks not to maximize pleasure, but is looking for optimum pleasure. And we're going to see one of the extremes here, where that's what one group of individuals, that's what they did, is they sought for that maximum pleasure, and pleasure in all things and at all times. But a true hedonist is someone who tries to track the narrow path between pleasure and pain. I think that's probably the best representation of a hedonist, but we're going to look at both parts of this as we move forward. Historically, we see hedonism not arising as a new thing, but it's something that finds its roots that goes all the way back to the early Greek culture with a group called the Cyrenaics. And it's even older than that particular group, than the Cyrenaics. But that's just the one that we can trace it back to historically. So we have a historical record of those individuals, but I'm absolutely certain that it is true that humans have always sought to increase their pleasure and decrease their pain. It's just that this is the oldest historical record that we have of groups of individuals who seem to focus their lives on this particular concept. The Cyrenaics were crass or crude hedonists. Crass or crude, and what that means is think ancient Roman orgy, right, with all of the different things that comes along with an orgy. And so the sexual aspect, but also they're going to be engaged in worshiping the god Bacchus, and Bacchus was the god of the vine or the god of wine, and so there's going to be lots of alcohol consumed. in this as well. So if you're thinking ancient Greek orgy and everything that that might include, and in large groups, obviously that's part of the definition of orgy. There's lots of people engaged here, and so there would be temples to Bacchus. They might gather there at the temple in some kind of worshiping ceremony and indulge themselves in all things that they could find pleasure in. And so that's the Cyrenaics. They're the crass ones. And so with these individuals, there were worshippers of Dionysus as well. And if you know anything about the Greek and Roman pantheon, often these individuals, these gods would cross lines. And so when the Romans conquered the Greeks, they kind of merged, they melded some of the gods and goddesses together. And so sometimes you'll see a god named one thing in Greece and another thing in Rome, and they would kind of merge them together. So for example, Hercules, that's the Roman name for Heracles, which is the Greek name for the same god. So that's not uncommon. So we've got these worshippers of Bacchus and Dionysus, and they would bring themselves together here, and they would indulge themselves in some type of alcoholic, sexual, and even a narcotic orgy as well. And so all of these things that these individuals would indulge themselves in. And it was a religious ceremony, because the idea here was that if they put themselves into a state of frenzy and got really, really excited, then hopefully these gods of fertility, the god of the vine, Bacchus here, hopefully these individuals, hopefully because these individuals were sexually excited, the gods would watch, they would get sexually excited, and then as the gods were sexually excited, then that would bring fertility to their vines, and so they would have a good harvest, right? So that's part of the thinking, that's part of the concept of what's happening inside the minds of these worshipers. But they also were looking to put themselves into a frenzied state so that they could get beyond their five senses and try to begin to see truth beyond what they could see with their normal senses, beyond what they could see with their five senses. And so this isn't necessarily unusual either. Lots of different there are lots of different reasons to try to get beyond our five senses. Sometimes it might just be for entertainment, but in this particular instance, what they're trying to do is they're looking for some type of greater truth. Now, that's not an unusual practice in the Greek culture, but it's also not an unusual practice in other cultures either. For example, there were many Native American groups who used the narcotic peyote, and peyote would often give them the sensation of taking what they would call a spirit journey. And so they might go off on the spirit journey through the use of these narcotics, and they would experience things that sometimes might reveal some type of truth for them, that might be a guide to their lives. It would take them above and beyond what they could experience with their five senses, and then somehow within that spirit journey, whatever type of vision it was they're experiencing, they might come back with some kind of knowledge or some kind of truth or some kind of influence that would guide them throughout their life. Perhaps they would talk to an ancestor or to a spirit guide, say the spirit of the bear or something like that. And so it's not unusual that we see these things happening in different cultures, but they certainly happened. They happened in that culture. They happen in many, many different cultures as well. Okay. So they were looking for some type of truth, and what they were trying to do is free themselves from their normal inhibitions. And inhibition is something that holds you back, so it inhibits you, and they're trying to get beyond things that inhibited themselves, and so that they could know these greater truths. We see this there with the, as I talked about with the Native Americans. We also see this happening in more recent cultures. If you are a student of American history, you'll see this happening with many of the hippies. And so while I don't know that Woodstock was necessarily the type of orgy that was going on in the temples of Dionysus, it certainly was a type of orgy, and there was plenty of chemical stimulants that were available there as well. Uh, Also, if you're thinking here again in our particular culture, think something like perhaps Pink Floyd concert. Although probably not so much orgy, but certainly the use of chemicals to try, and then in this case the use of music as well, to try to get you above and beyond your normal senses, and so that you might experience something that takes you further in, and you're searching for a type of truth. And I'm a fan of Pink Floyd. Many of their songs are absolutely tremendous, and if you really pay attention to what the artist is trying to what they're trying to say, the message that they're trying to deliver, it can often show you and kind of guide you to a type of truth. And I would point you to the song Comfortably Numb. There's a great truth that lies in that particular song if you don't just enjoy the lyrics, don't just enjoy the music, but to take a deeper look, and you'll find that they're poking around, they're trying to guide people toward truth. Also in literature, and kind of stepping a little further back in time now, with the book Alice in Wonderland, with Through the Looking Glass. That particular story in literature is a story about a young girl who is trying to grow up. That's why Alice is like 13 years old, right? She's moving from childhood to adulthood, and what she's experiencing as a child is a world that makes sense, but as she's trying to move into adulthood, what she's moving into is a world that is complete chaos, and often makes no sense at all. And so she goes down the rabbit hole. That's where we get this phrase from. She goes down the rabbit hole. She falls deep into this rabbit hole, and she meets a number of different characters that are absolutely outrageous and even ridiculous. And so we get the characters Tweedledee and Tweedledum. We get the Mad Hatter and the March Hare. We get the Evil Queen, who's constantly shouting off with her head, and we get the White Rabbit, who's kind of an odd character, but she's constantly chasing this rabbit. She's chasing time. She's chasing this thing that she's after. He's after a meeting, and she's trying to constantly meet with him. The Cheshire Cat that she meets, again, there's so much symbolism in this one, but the one I wanted to talk about here in particular, I think one of the more important characters is the caterpillar that she meets. And if you recall, especially in the Disney cartoon, the caterpillar is sitting on a mushroom, and the character is smoking a hookah. Now, Disney could get away with this, and when that movie first came out, there's no way in the world they could create this character today. You can't even show a cartoon character smoking a cigarette, much less a hookah. And so with this character, though, with the caterpillar, he's sitting there on the mushroom, and he's smoking using chemicals to try to search for a greater truth. And what he keeps asking, the question he keeps asking Alice is, who are you, right? And she's on this journey to try to learn who she is, because she's moving from childhood to adulthood. And so she's on this tremendous journey, and the caterpillar is kind of pushing her towards this question, but that's why she's down this rabbit hole. She's trying to find out who she is. And what we find is that in the life of teenagers, that's often one of the quests that teenagers are on. They're trying to figure out who they are. That's why it's not why, there's brain chemistry involved that I don't want to get into, with the prefrontal cortex and all those type of things. But within that brain chemistry, and their personality constantly fluctuates. And one day they're kind of this, and a week later they're kind of this, and they'll shift back and forth. But what you'll find is that eventually their brain will fully develop, their prefrontal cortex will fully form, and their personality will kind of set in and become more solid. 20, 21, it's different for everybody, but somewhere in there, right? She's beginning this quest, and the world doesn't make sense. She's trying to discover who she is, and so this use of chemicals there, even within the story of Alice in Wonderland, what we see is that it's not unusual that in many different cultures that's been part of those cultures. Now, at this point, I like to tell my students about a dig that was done in South and Central America. One civilization, they came upon a city, and as they were excavating throughout the city, they found a house, and it wasn't unusual for this culture to bury their dead in a grave beneath the house. And so they would dig a hole in the dirt floor and then bury that person there. It's kind of odd for us, but the grave was there in the house with the family. One woman's grave that they found and excavated contained the woman's body, but it contained three other items, or not quite an item, one of them wasn't, um, that I think is particularly telling for humanity and what we are. The grave also contained the skeletal remains of a baby, right? And so that's not really an item, it's the skeletal remains of a baby. But it contained a baby. The grave also contained a kind of a pipe type thing, something that was obviously a musical instrument, although not something that we really have or see in our culture today, but it was clearly a musical instrument. And then it also contained a pipe that was something like a crack pipe, but not a crack pipe, but it was obviously used to ingest some type of chemical narcotic. And so those three things were buried with this woman. I think one of the things that tells us about humanity, and it's somewhat joking, but it also is, I think, part of a truth that is part of who we are, is that what that means is that humans have always had three things involved in their lives. Drugs, obviously with a crack pipe, sex, there was a baby, and rock and roll. We've got three things because you've got that musical instrument. We seem to strive after and enjoy and indulge in these things. And that seems to be really part of what humanity is like. And this is one of the oldest civilizations that we found, so apparently humanity really does focus on these three things. It seems to be kind of part of what we are. So we search for that pleasure, we search for it in very deep ways, but often, sometimes I guess, but often it's not just the pleasure that we're looking for. We're looking for meaning and purpose within those pleasures as well. So sometimes it goes beyond just the actual indulgence, and we're looking for that greater thing. We're looking for that truth. And so here with the Syrian addicts in ancient Greece, they would go into these temples, and yes, they were there to be part of the orgy, but there were also people there who were trying to reach and achieve some type of greater truth, just like individuals today who are indulging in different methodologies of pleasure. In our culture, often they were looking to reach some type of higher understanding, some type of greater knowledge. And so we see that in the ancient world, both past the ancient Greeks and then in the ancient Greeks, and we see it in our culture today. Okay, people believed, and still believe, that they could get in touch with the spiritual realm by getting high. And here you should note that it's not called getting low. You're getting high. You're trying to reach something above and beyond and outside of. And so in this case, they were doing this, trying to get high. It's not just the use of chemicals or that sexual frenzied state. There was more to it there in the ancient Greek world. There was also temple prostitutes as well. And so if you were trying to get beyond your normal inhibitions, you might use some chemicals, and then there would be prostitutes to help you with the sexual part as well. And that was really their job. That was what they did. They might specialize in that particular type of, I guess we would call it a career path. And so, and they're trying to get you to a state of ecstasy where the soul would be freed, and you could come to understand those types of greater truths. And I should say, for any of you who wonder if this is, wonder that this might be a little odd or a little crazy, I've never used drugs, and I've never visited a prostitute, but I have had an experience of ecstasy that was brought on really by accident. And so part of my background, part of my job experience, I grew up doing a lot of different manual labor and also farm work with cows and chickens, but I've also worked some in the timber industry. And so one time I was working with a fellow who, it was our job to go in after they would clear out, say 100 acres of trees to harvest it for lumber. Our job was to go in because they would cut all the limbs off and they'd top the pine trees and then they'd pile those things up into big piles. Our job was to come in and burn those piles. And so depending on the size of the area, it would depend on the different piles of trees, but this was being done, we were burning mostly in, say, June, July, somewhere in there. And so some days it was too hot, and you didn't want to burn when it was too hot, or the fire would get away. If the wind was too high, it'd get away. But sometimes nighttime, when that came, the temperatures dropped, and the winds would drop, and the humidity would go up, and so it might be a really safe time to burn. And so a couple times we did night burns. And so one time I was walking through, and it was pretty moonless that night. It was pretty dark. So I was kind of just seeing my way with the fires that I was lighting. And I come across some of these piles could be really, really long. And so this one was like 200 feet long. So it was super long. I couldn't even see the end of it. So I come along and I start dropping fire on what I thought was just a single line of tops and limbs. But as the fire started going up, and this is pine tops, they burn really fast, as that started burning, I realized that there was another line the same size over here on my right hand. I'd just been dropping on the left. And so I was like, I'll burn that one too. And went over and started dropping fire on this one. There's probably only 15 feet between these two piles. No big deal, right? I'm just dropping fire. Well, behind me, the fire is really starting to roll. And I just kept walking and dropping fire. And what I didn't know is that when I got to the end of these two, what I thought were lines of piles, there was instead a horseshoe. And so these two piles were connected. And you should understand that this pile of brush is like 25 feet high. So there's no way in the world I'm going to be able to scramble over the top of this thing, because the fire is now burning through. And like I say, pine tops burn really fast. And so it's catching up to me. Now the flames are 60, 70 feet high. This is massive fire. And so what I'm doing now, because it's starting to get hot, because the flames are all around me, is I turn around and I start running to get out of the fire zone. And it's about 200 feet. But as I ran, and as the danger became more and more real, and as the fire continued to rise, I reached a state of ecstasy where I was both terrified and thrilled all at the same time, because of this massive fire and the danger. And kind of what I'm going to say is it tapped into the only thing I can call it is a kind of primal instinct, right? Now, I'm a pretty rational, down-to-earth, practical type person, but the feeling of ecstasy that this brought on was absolutely tremendous. And obviously I made it to the end and survived, because here I am. But when I got to the other end, I remember turning around and sitting there and kind of breathing really, really hard, and I'm just looking at this magnificent fire. It's a kind of a warm summer night, but there's this massive blaze. And I, for the first time in my life, understood what the ancients would have experienced when they built this huge bonfire and danced around it. It would have taken them to a place of ecstasy. This is why the war dance the night before you go into battle, because of all the adrenaline and all of the ecstasy that this is going to produce in your body. And so this is something that humanity it seems to be part of us. It's something that we really, really have that seems to work in our minds. And so this type of pleasure, that type of ecstasy, that type of freeing ourselves of our senses and experiencing something above and beyond just what we get as we walk around in our normal everyday lives. So yeah, that's something that lots of people have, searched for. It's something that lots of people have certainly experienced as well. All right, so those Cyrenaics, the Dionysians, they were the crude hedonists. There was another group of hedonists, and these individuals were called the Epicureans. You might have heard the word Epicureans, but they're another group of hedonists. But they are not trying to find, they're not looking for that all-encompassing experience of pleasure. Instead, what they're looking for is more of a refined pleasure. They're someone who has exquisite tastes, both in food and in wine. And so they're not looking to overindulge themselves in wine. They're looking to get a hold of some good, say, quality wine and enjoy what they're drinking, but they're not looking to go get drunk and indulge themselves in an orgy. Rather, they're looking to find the best of wines and enjoy the taste. So they seek out the best of wines and food, but they're not drunkards. They indulge themselves in the finest things in life. but they're not overindulging themselves in these. And so they're a much more balanced hedonist. They're a much more I've lost the word I'm looking for there. Cultured in the sense of that they're looking for the best of experiences and pleasure, but they're not looking to overindulge in those pleasures. So one of the things that the Epicureans, one of the reasons that they didn't seek to indulge or overindulge was because they had come to understand something very, very important within this life that they had focused on, where they're searching for pleasure. Now remember, hedonism is the word, and the word hedone in Greek just means desire, okay? So hedone means desire, but when you put the ism on the back end of that word, it becomes a philosophy, and so they're looking for everything that they desire. They're looking for pleasurable things in life, right? That's the worldview. Life is about finding pleasure and avoiding pain. So in this case, these Epicureans, they understood that you didn't simply go out and look for all that life had to offer, all the pleasures that you could get, or all the time. So why not? One of the problems that these hedonists face is that if you are constantly looking for pleasure or the things that you desire in life, if you're constantly looking for that, one of two things is going to happen. One, you're not going to be able to get it, and number two, you are going to be able to get it, right? So those two things will happen. You'll get what you desire, or you won't get what you desire. So the second one then, where you don't get what you desire, whichever one I said was first, if you don't get what you desire, what happens? Well, that brings frustration because you're not getting what you're after. Now, if you've ever pursued someone romantically and then did not achieve, gaining their romantic consideration in return, what happens to you? Well, there's frustration, there's pain. It's certainly not going to be a pleasureful experience. And so on the one hand, if you seek pleasure and you don't get pleasure, what do you get? Well, you get more pain. On the other hand, if you seek for pleasure and you achieve that pleasure and then you indulge yourself in that pleasure, what's going to happen is eventually you'll reach a state where you become tired of, or you become bored with the pleasure that once had given to you. And so imagine that you really, really wanted, say, I'm just going to go something kind of lighter and easier than some of these others, a video game. If you ever really wanted a video game, you desired it with everything, and you finally achieved it, you acquired that video game, and you sat and you played it, and you played it and played it and played it for hours and hours and hours, then what happens is eventually is that you become bored with the video game because you overindulged in it, and so it becomes something that isn't really useful for you anymore. It doesn't bring the pleasure that it used to bring. And the same can be true, say, for sexual experiences or drug experiences or alcohol experiences. And that's why when certain individuals, we're going to use drugs because it's the easy one. If you're using drugs, you might start out with something kind of mild, and then eventually that doesn't do it, does it? And so you have to go up. And so that does it for a while, but then it doesn't. And then you have to go up. And so that type of thing the ancient Greeks understood as well, because if you achieve what you're after, you become bored with it. And boredom is also going to become then eventually painful, not pleasureful. And so what happens is that this leads to what the Greeks called the hedonist's paradox. And so within the hedonist paradox, what that means is that if you achieve the thing that you're after, if you're searching for pleasure and you achieve it in this particular area, eventually when you overindulge or when you do it long enough, it's not going to bring you that pleasure any longer. And so it's going to lose its appeal. And so if you achieve the pleasure that you were searching for, you lose. On the other hand, if you achieve, or if you don't achieve the pleasure that you were searching for, if you're not able to acquire whatever it is that you were after, then that's painful as well, and so you lose. So whether you achieve the pleasure that you were after, or whether you don't achieve the pleasure you were after, you lose. Either way, you lose. And that's the hedonist paradox. And they began to see this, they began to understand that this was the case, and so that led many of them to come to believe that there had to be more to it than just the simple searching for pleasure or avoiding pain in life. Now, the Epicureans, the more balanced of the hedonists that we're talking about here, also understood something else about hedonism and searching for pleasure, especially when it came to alcohol and when it came to food. They began to understand that those who overindulge bulge. That is to say, they gain weight and they're not going to have as happy or as productive a life. And so simply going out and overindulging all the time is not going to be something that's healthy. It's not going to be something that's going to lead them to a happier, fulfilling life. They understood that indulging in momentary pleasure could also have long-term consequences, not just in the sense of, say, like we're saying, health issues in the area of weight gain. But they also understood that if you indulge in too much wine, at some point you're going to stop enjoying the wine. First of all, because you're going to be too drunk to really know what you're doing, and second of all, because tomorrow, or depending on how long you drink, I suppose, at some point when you stop drinking, you're also going to have to endure the hangover that comes with consuming too much alcohol. So they understood that, yes, momentary pleasure, yes, it might be pleasureful, but there's going to be some type of long-term consequence if you overindulge. And if you engage in too much sex, and especially if you engage with too many partners, then eventually an STD might be in your future as well. So overindulging, not using any form of moderation, is also then understood to be part of the consequences of not understanding how to track that path that I mentioned earlier of pleasure and pain. So the Epicureans tried to form some kind of balance within hedonism where they weren't always overindulging in these kinds of pleasures. They did that for a number of reasons, the consequences that we just mentioned, but also because they wanted to keep excitement in the human heart. And what that means is that again, if you overindulge all the time, then the wine will eventually cease to taste good. Or I'm going to say steak. The steak is eventually going to begin to lose its flavor if all you do is eat steak all the time. You'll get tired of it. So rather than exhausting themselves of these pleasures, they tried to keep a balance, and that kept the kind of excitement, as we said here, in the human heart. In addition to keeping excitement in the human heart, they were also looking to achieve what they called Ataraxia. And Ataraxia is just the Greek word for peace of mind. And within this concept, within the idea here of peace of mind, searching for some type of peace, the idea is that you come to grips with who and what you are and where you are in your life, and you allow that, and these are my conditions, and somehow you come to terms with that, and you become settled and peaceful within yourself about these types of things. And so you're looking for peace of mind, so that as you move through your life, you are in a constant state of peace no matter what is happening in your surroundings. And so looking for that kind of ataraxia. This is also not a new thing, looking for ataraxia. The Stoics in the ancient Greek culture were also looking for the same thing. Now, they took a different position than the Epicureans. They took the position of don't get your hopes up, don't get your hopes down. They had a deterministic view of life, and if you remember the deterministic view, within the deterministic view, what that means is that everything is determined. Now, it can be determined by several different things. It can be determined if there is no deity, and all things are determined, say, by the chemical reactions, by the physical world. It could also be determined by a deity. Maybe if that deity is fully in control, it determines that everything that happens. That's also a deterministic position. So with the Stoics, either of those views could be part of their view. It really didn't matter. But they thought all things were determined, and so really all you had to do was to control how you responded to the things that were outside of your control. And so if today I'm driving down the road and I have a flat tire, I can't control the fact that I have a flat tire. All I can control is how I behave towards my flat tire. It should be pointed out that if they're true determinists, they can't really believe that how they respond is anything but determined either, right? So I think there might have been a misstep in their thinking there, because many of them are thinking that I can't control what happens externally, but I can control what happens internally. But if all things are determined, then they also can't control what's happening internally either. But that's a different discussion for a different time. But the Stoics here, taking that position of I can control how it is that I behave towards the things that happen around me. And so when it comes to that active pursuit of pleasure and avoidance of pain, for them, it was really just the idea of controlling how you act according to what comes your way, whether it be a painful event or a pleasureful event. Either way, it really didn't make any difference. And so if you've heard of someone being called a Stoic, many times like a stoic or a stone or a mountain or a tree, they seem to just take what comes their way. And so there were those Stoics there in ancient Greece as well. Now, kind of coming back to our culture and thinking about this for just a moment. There are a few people in our culture who will come out and tell you that hedonism is their worldview. Now, it's becoming more and more prevalent that people will do it because it's becoming more acceptable in the eyes of others. But even then, many, even most individuals who might have this worldview hesitate to simply say, I'm a hedonist, I'm just looking for pleasure and trying to avoid pain in all things. It's something that seems to be frowned upon often in our culture, because how many of us would simply admit that our entire world revolves around just the search for pleasure? It seems almost crass. It seems, as we said before, almost crude. So a Hugh Hefner might have been one who would have come out and said this, and his lifestyle would certainly have at least seemingly lent itself to this was his worldview, even if it wasn't. I don't know him. Perhaps it was not. But his lifestyle and kind of what he represented to the world, what he, at least the character at least that he portrayed to the world, seemed to be one that perhaps indulged in this type of lifestyle. And there seems to be kind of a stigma attached to it. But try to be honest with yourself and figure out maybe this really is your worldview. And if it is, somehow come to terms with it, as we talked about there with Ataraxia. That kind of peace of mind, knowing who you are, is going to lend itself to accepting yourself, and then, eventually you'll come to terms with perhaps this is your worldview. And if it is, certainly try to figure that out for yourself. And here's something that can help you if you think this might be your worldview. If that is your worldview, isn't it true that all of us seek pleasure and all of us seek to avoid pain? Isn't that true of all humans? I think the answer there has to be yes. And even if you're a masochist, and a masochist is someone who finds pleasure through physical pain, through some type of abuse, and that can be multiple types of different physical abuse, and for different reasons. Sometimes it's sexual, sometimes it's non-sexual, sometimes it's just that these individuals will say self-flagellation, which is beating themselves with a whip, and it might be something that they truly gain some type of pleasure from. Well, even though they're finding pleasure through pain, they're still searching for pleasure. So don't all humans search for pleasure and try to avoid pain? Well, yes, absolutely. That's certainly going to be part of the human experience. I think the difference here is when you put the ism on the word. You're only a hedonist who's indulging in hedonism if your entire world revolves around trying to gain pleasure or avoid pain. If there are other things in your life that are more important than these two things, then perhaps you're not a hedonist. You're not someone indulging in hedonism. And so trying to figure out, just separating, this is what I do and this is my ultimate goal, from, yeah, well, I search for pleasure as well. Everyone does. So trying to divide those two lines. Is it an ism, or is it something that you do simply because that's kind of what humans do? One of the reasons that I wanted to give this particular lecture and have you kind of think about these ideas as well, is because of some of the modern forms of hedonism and some of the things that it has brought to our culture, because it's become much more common in our culture in the last, say 50 years, but also because of how it's changed the thinking of individuals within our culture. So I wanted to focus a little bit on how it's influenced not just those who follow it as a worldview, but how it has influenced even thinking within our culture that of those who don't follow it as a worldview. So think about it for just a moment. In recent decades, it has been more of a search for euphoria, not ataraxia, not peace of mind, but euphoria. It is emphasized this idea of feeling, and the idea of that feeling is perhaps all that matters, or at least what really matters is how I feel about this or how I feel about that. So if I'm listening to my students carefully, and I do, I hear students say things like, I feel that we should do, right? Now in an ethics class, that's gonna make my antennas pop up, right? That's gonna be a red flag here or there. I feel that we should. Well, is it really just based on a feeling, or is it based on something more solid than simply I like this or I don't like this? And so I also hear students say things like, I feel Descartes is wrong, or I feel Immanuel Kant is wrong. Well, they don't feel that Descartes is wrong. They don't feel that Kant is wrong. At least I hope they don't. Hopefully what they're doing is they're actually thinking that Descartes is wrong, or they're thinking that Kant is wrong. They think rather than feel. But that terminology often changes in our culture because we've emphasized feelings so dramatically, that we've begun to replace thinking with feeling. And so if you look, though, at these two words, you begin to see that they're not necessarily interchangeable. And so what I mean when I say that they're not interchangeable, think about the phrase, for example, because in our culture people have begun to think that they feel thoughts, and you don't feel thoughts. Think about this phrase for a moment and see if you think thinking and feeling are actually synonymous. In our culture, people feel they think feelings. Now, I didn't misread that. I read that correctly. In our culture, people feel they think feelings. That doesn't make sense. Nobody thinks feelings. You don't think feelings. You have them. But your thinking and your feeling are different processes, or at least they should be, and you should understand how to distinguish between I feel something and, in this case, I think something. How pervasive is hedonism in our culture? It's very pervasive, and so there are literature teachers who are now looking for literature that the students feel good about, instead of looking for literature that makes them think or is somehow useful and good in their education. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with finding literature that you enjoy, but having an education, there's more to it than just feeling good about the things that you're reading. So there's more going on here than just, I feel this about my education. Well, what do you think about it? And there's a difference, a great difference in those two. Also, thinking about how our culture's changed, there's a book called The Chemical People, and in that book, it's about alcohol and drug abuse in our culture today. There's a story in the book about a 15-year-old girl who, in 1963, was taken to a hospital and admitted to a psych ward for alcoholism. Now, that was 1963, and the workers there at the hospital were shocked that a 15-year-old girl could be caught up in alcoholism. Today, in our culture, because we've emphasized the search for pleasure and avoidance of pain so much, there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of 15-year-old teenagers, not just girls, boys and girls, who are alcoholics. There are any number of these individuals in our culture, so much so that nobody's shocked when we hear about a 15-year-old alcoholic any longer. And so it's something that in our culture has moved more from, it's become a norm, it's become normal, it's become, that we know that this is here. It's not just that it happens, it's really part of our culture, whereas it used to not be, right? So it has progressed and moved forward, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to focus on this lecture, was because I think it is become more and more pervasive in our culture, and so I wanted you to be able to see it, to have some of the details, see the difference in, say, crude hedonists and those who are looking for more exquisite taste. There's a difference in those. To think about it for yourself, to try to figure out, where is pleasure and avoidance of pain in my life? Where is it that, what place does that take in my life? Am I a hedonist? Am I embracing hedonism? Or is it just that, yes, I do seek pleasure and avoid pain like all humans do, but there's something more important in my life? And so I really wanted to focus on this so that you could have the opportunity to reflect on yourselves, to try to see kind of where you were at, but then also to begin to reflect on others and try to see, perhaps within the life that you have, loved ones or coworkers, maybe to help you understand someone else in your life who is engaging in hedonism as a worldview. Perhaps it'll help you to understand why it is that they're doing what they're doing. Don't they know they're ruining their life? Yes, maybe they know, but if pleasure, indulging in pleasure, is really what they think is the most important thing, maybe that's why they're doing this again and again and again, even though the long-term consequences might be destructive. If this is their worldview, then what they're doing is they're anticipating some other pleasure that will come along that will then bring them pleasure at some later date, and pleasure stays there as the primary focus of their life. So perhaps it'll help you understand them. Might also help you understand people that you don't really know. And so in our world, as we're looking around perhaps on, say, YouTube or Facebook, or if we see things on the news, or if we see things in the political realm, it helps me a lot in the political realm if I understand people's worldviews. This is why they don't think what I think. This is why they think we should do this over here, make these laws, rather than these laws that I think we should make. It's because their worldview is radically different than mine. So hopefully this will help you to kind of understand. That's why I wanted to focus on it and give you some more information on it, because it's so prevalent that hopefully that perhaps it will help you to understand some of the different parts of our society today. As I'm certain many of you will know someone, and maybe yourself, and you know yourself, so maybe you're that one, others around you. Hopefully this will help you to understand them, and hopefully you'll begin to understand that's why they make the moral choices that they make as well. They base everything on pleasure and pain. So it's not just about, I'm doing these things, but I'm doing these things morally because indulge in pleasure and avoid pain. So that's a little bit about hedonism. And there in the next semester we'll come back and we'll begin talking about the different moral theories for the semester.